This is a response to Epydemic 2020's video entitled Slavery in the Bible. Although his video is approximately 2 years old, I have selected it for two reasons. First, of all of the videos I've seen justifying slavery in the Bible, this one probably makes the most extreme claims. And secondly, since I have already responded to one of Epydemic's videos on morality, I thought I would continue my discussion with him. Let's begin.
I believe that biblical slavery does not involve slave traders or view slaves as inferior. A person becomes a slave if they are unable to pay a debt. The slaves have the same right as their masters, and it was really just a difference in economic status. And if you don't have to take my word for it, I'm going to show you some evidence. So let's see what the Bible has to say. Starting in Deuteronomy 15:12. If a fellow Hebrew, a man or woman, sells himself to you and serves 6 years, in the 7th year you must let him go free. Sells himself to you. Yep, that's what it says. So he sells himself.
Epydemic is correct. The verse does say sells himself. However, it is important to understand that this verse is specifically referring to Hebrew slaves. It does not address non-Hebrew slaves. Epydemic would lead us to believe that, other than a release during the year of Jubilee, there was no difference between Hebrew and non-Hebrew slaves. However, as I will discuss later, this just simply is not the case.
But to be fair, that verse doesn't say anything about slave traders. But these next two verses do. If we take a look at Exodus 21:16, it says, anyone who kidnaps another and sells him, or still has him when he is caught, must be put to death. So if you're a slave trader, you get put to death. And Deuteronomy 24:7, if a man is caught kidnapping one of his brother Israelites and treats him as a slave or sells him, the kidnapper must die. You must purge the evil from among you. So this verse repeats that if you are a slave trader, you die, so it must be important. Not only does the law not allow the buying and selling of slaves, but you get put to death for it. So I would say it's pretty heavily discouraged.
Well, not really. The verses Epydemic quoted, once again, are only applicable to Hebrews. They say nothing regarding non-Hebrew slaves.
So now we're going to take a look at what the Bible says about the rights of slaves. Deuteronomy 16:12. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and follow carefully these decrees. Now, this verse shows us that the Israelites knew what it was like to be true slaves, and they did not model that behavior. The slaves actually had feasts and days off just like all the rest of the people. Deuteronomy 15:12-14. In the 7th year you must let him go free, and when you release him, do not send him away empty-handed. Supply him liberally from your flock. So, this verse is saying that it's about the year of Jubilee, and their debt would be pardoned on the 7th year. This also helps us realize that they were not sold into slavery, but became slaves because of their debt. It also shows us that their masters were very kind to them. So now let's look at Exodus 23:9. Do not oppress an alien. You yourselves know how it feels to be aliens, because you were aliens in the land of Egypt. So this makes a distinction between the oppressive slavery in Egypt and the slavery seen in Israel. Leviticus 19:34 says, the alien living among you must be treated as one of your native born. Love him as yourself. You are aliens in Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So here we're supposed to treat him as a native born and love him as yourself. That's not even reminiscent of the slavery we know today.
Unfortunately for Epydemic, this verse doesn't actually address the rights of slaves. Instead, it discusses the treatment of aliens. The Hebrew word translated aliens is ger, which means temporary inhabitant or newcomer lacking inherited rights. This is much different than a slave. I can only assume that Epydemic concluded aliens and slaves were synonymous from the phrase, for you were aliens in Egypt. However, it appears Epydemic might have forgotten that the Jews were in Egypt for many years as aliens before they actually became slaves. Scriptural evidence which shows that aliens are indeed different than slaves can be found in Exodus 20:10. But the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your manservant or maidservant, nor your animals, nor the aliens within your gates.
So now let's talk about lifelong slavery. As mentioned earlier, if an Israelite took another Israelite as a slave, it would be pardoned 7 years later. An Israelite only became a slave for life if he wanted to, and this is seen in Deuteronomy 15, verses 16 and 17. But if your servant says to you, I do not want to leave you because he loves you and your family as well, loves you and your family and is well off with you, then take an awl and push it through his earlobe to the door, and he will become your servant for life. Do the same for your maidservant. So this is clearly a choice. If you want to stay, you can, and if you don't, you can leave.
I don't think the situation is so clear-cut as Epydemic would lead us to believe. To truly understand the context of what is being said here, I'd like to reference the parallel passage found in Exodus 21, 2-5. Here, we are more able to clearly see the choice the servant actually had. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he is to serve you for 6 years, but in the 7th year he shall go free without paying anything. If he comes alone, he is to go free alone. But if he has a wife when he comes, she is to go with him. If his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the woman and her children shall belong to her master, and only the man shall go free. But if the servant declares, I love my master and my wife and children, and do not want to go free, then his master must take him before the judges. He shall take him to the door or doorpost and pierce his ear with an awl. Then he will be his servant for life. During this time it was not uncommon for slave owners to give their Hebrew servants wives. Although this might appear to be a kind act, there was often an ulterior motive. Since this slave would be unable to take his wife and children with him when he departed, he would often stay because he couldn't bear leaving them. In this scenario, what choice did the servant really have?
So now I'm going to check out Leviticus 25 verses 44 and 46, because these verses are probably misinterpreted the most often. This verse deals with slaves coming from foreign nations, and the only real difference between those slaves and the Israelite slaves is that the year of Jubilee did not apply to them. The year of Jubilee was a cultural perk for the Israelites. So, Leviticus 25:44. Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. This verse is describing the same type of slavery used on the fellow Israelites. We know this because the King James Version explains that fairly clearly. And in this verse, people were not buying slaves from traders. The money goes to the person selling himself into slavery, or goes to pay off his debt.
Epydemic's statement that the King James Version more clearly explains that people were not buying these slaves from slave traders is perplexing. I can only assume he draws his conclusion from the King James's use of the word bondmen to describe these individuals. The actual Hebrew word used here is eved. This word is found many times in the Old Testament and has a number of different meanings. What is interesting is that the same word is also used to describe the Hebrews in Exodus 5:15 and 16. Then the Israelite foreman went and appealed to Pharaoh, Why have you treated your servants this way? Your servants are given no straw, yet we are told make bricks. Your servants are being beaten, but the fault is with your own people. Notice that the same Hebrew word aved is used to describe the relationship between the Jews and Pharaoh. Should we imply from this that the Jews sold themselves into slavery? Of course not. It would be irresponsible to assume an intended meaning from reading only one verse. Therefore, I suggest that we examine the surrounding context to determine the author's intent. So, how does Leviticus 20:44-46 use the word aved? Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can will them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life. but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. I'd like to focus on the end of verse 46, which states, "But you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly." Notice that a clear distinction is made between Hebrew slaves and slaves from other nations. The command specifically states that fellow Hebrews were not to be treated ruthlessly. This command signifies a difference between these two groups, implying that non-Hebrew slaves could be treated ruthlessly. And since these slaves were different than Hebrew slaves, there is no reason to assume that they had sold themselves into slavery, but instead were likely purchased from slave traders. Additionally, because they could be willed to the children of the owner, it seems likely that they were purchased for the entirety of their lives.
Now let's look at God's supposed instructions on how to beat your slaves to death. Alright, Exodus 21:20. If a man beats his male or female slave with a rod, and the slave dies as a direct result, he must be punished. Now, if we look at Deuteronomy 19:21, we can see exactly what this punishment is. Show no pity, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. So the punishment of beating your slave is death. Now let's look at Exodus 21:21. But he is not to be punished if the slave gets up after a day or two, since the slave is his property. So what that's saying is that if you don't end up killing your slave and he gets up and he lives, then you're not punished by death. But what you are punished by is seen in Exodus 21:27. And if he knocks out the tooth of a manservant or maidservant, he must let the servant go free to compensate for the tooth. So if there's ever any serious injury to a slave, then the slave gets to go free and is pardoned of his debt.
To understand these verses, we must first determine whether the slaves being referenced were Hebrew, non-Hebrew, or both. I believe the answer to this is found in Exodus 21:2, where Hebrew slaves are specifically addressed. As the context never changes, I believe we can reasonably conclude that the commands and penalties referenced here are likely only applicable when Hebrew slaves were involved. Once again, Leviticus 25:46 makes it clear that non-Hebrew slaves could be treated more ruthless than Hebrew slaves. Now, the second point I would like to make is that although the master was to be punished when death occurred or eyes or teeth were damaged, he still had the right to beat his slave. Epydemic argues that since the owner could not damage the eyes or teeth of slaves without punishment, the law restricted his ability to beat them. However, I don't get the same understanding from reading this passage. The text clearly states that masters could lawfully beat their slaves even to the point of unconsciousness. To avoid punishment, the only requirements were that the eyes and teeth of the slave must be undamaged, and he is able to stand within 2 days. Perhaps this is less ruthless than what occurred with slavery in the United States. However, to argue that such treatment was humane seems silly. There is one additional form of slavery that Epydemic neglected to mention in his video. Captives of war were often taken as slaves. Deuteronomy 20:10 and 11 says, "When you march up to attack a city, make its people an offer of peace. If they accept and open their gates, all the people in it shall be subject to forced labor and shall work for you." Now, if the inhabitants of an enemy city surrendered when they were being attacked by the Jews, they were allowed to live, but only at the cost of becoming slaves. If they didn't surrender, well, that will be the focus of another video. I'm always amazed when individuals choose to ignore the cruelty and savagery of slavery in the Bible in an attempt to justify it. Regardless of what Christians may say, it is clear from reading the Old Testament that slavery was a common practice and one which Yahweh supported. When I read Old Testament passages regarding slavery, I can't even fathom that a God was involved in the creation of these laws. Instead, I think they were simply the result of human thinking at the time. However, if I'm wrong and the Bible is true, then Yahweh is a moral monster.